The rain fell heavy that night. Not a whisper of wind, just the drumbeat of water against rooftops and pavement. Inside a small dimly lit home on the edge of the forest, Evelyn, a 37-year-old hospice nurse, held her father's cold hand. His breath was ragged, shallow. He hadn't spoken in hours, until now. With sudden clarity, he turned his head and whispered, "You were never mine." Evelyn froze. "What did you say?" she asked, tears mixing with the sweat on her brow. "You were adopted. I wasn't allowed to tell you," he rasped. Then, silence. The heart monitor flatlined. Evelyn's world ruptured. Her entire identity, shattered in 7 words. A scream echoed in her soul, but her lips never moved. The nurse in her knew what to do next, but the daughter in her had ceased to exist. Her hands trembled. The walls felt like they were closing in. All her childhood memories, the bedtime stories, the Christmas mornings, the fights, the laughter, were now suspended in betrayal. The funeral was held 3 days later, beneath a pale winter sun. Friends offered their condolences, but none could touch the storm inside Evelyn. She stood beside the casket, not as a daughter, but as a stranger. The man she'd mourned was no longer her father in truth, only in memory. People spoke of his kindness, his wisdom, his love, but to her his final truth had severed those bonds. A priest recited sacred verses. Evelyn didn't hear a word. Instead, her mind replayed the whisper, "You were never mine." It echoed beneath every eulogy like a bell tolling in her bones. Wait. Her hands remained cold, her eyes fixed. There were no tears this time. Just a hollow ache where identity once lived. As dirt hit the casket lid, she clenched her fists. Something had to give. She couldn't live as a ghost of someone else's lie. That night, Evelyn returned to the house she grew up in, alone. The smell of old wood and lavender cleaning products greeted her like ghosts. She wandered the halls, touching picture frames and furniture that once carried meaning. Now they felt hollow. Her childhood room was untouched. Shelves of old toys, faded posters, a photo of her and the man she now doubted. She opened a drawer and found a sealed letter. Her name was written in trembling cursive. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. "Forgive me," it began. Her breath caught. The letter explained everything. How her real mother died during childbirth. How her father had promised to love her as his own. It was written years ago, meant to be delivered after his death. Evelyn dropped to the floor, letter in hand, her soul teetering between rage and mercy. The clock ticked past midnight. Evelyn sat at the edge of her childhood bed, the letter beside her, its final line carved into her soul. "You were always my light." She stared out the window into the darkness, wondering who she truly was. Not just the adopted girl, but the woman shaped by lies, love, and a quiet man who hid the truth not out of malice, but fear. Her breathing steadied. She realized the fracture inside her wasn't just about bloodlines. It was about identity, about roots torn from soil. She needed to understand who she was without the stories she had been told. The silence in the room no longer felt empty. It felt like a beginning. Morning light bled through the curtains. Evelyn stood in front of a mirror, wearing the same clothes as the day before. She stared into her own eyes as if meeting a stranger. "Who are you?" she whispered. No answer came. But in the mirror, something shifted, a subtle strength, a flicker of clarity. She wasn't defined by the lie. She wasn't undone. Not yet. She tied her hair back, opened her closet, and pulled out a suitcase. It was time to go. Not away from pain, but toward truth. She didn't know where she was headed, but she knew she couldn't stay. The past had given her an ending. Now she had to find the beginning. Evelyn arrived at a quiet mountain town by dusk, a place with no name on major maps, just whispers among travelers. She checked into a small inn run by an elderly couple who asked no questions. That suited her fine. The room was bare but peaceful, wooden floors, a modest bed, and a view of the valley below. For the first time in days, Evelyn exhaled without sobbing. That night, she walked to a local tea house. It was empty except for a bearded man in robes sweeping the floor. "Are you open?" she asked. He smiled. "Always if you seek something." She sat. "I don't know what I'm looking for," she said. "Then you are ready to find it," he replied. The words fell on her like warm rain. Something in his eyes didn't demand, just accept it. Evelyn's heart eased for a moment. The storm hadn't passed, but she'd found stillness within it. The next morning, Evelyn awoke to birdsong and the scent of earth. The innkeeper handed her a slip of paper. "The monk awaits at the river shrine." She followed a winding trail until she reached a wooden footbridge over a gentle stream. There he stood, the same man from the tea house. "Why are you here?" he asked without turning. "To remember who I am, or to forget what I was," she answered. He nodded. "Then listen, not just to words, but to silence." They stood without speaking. The wind stirred the water. Leaves danced across the surface. Evelyn felt the pull of her thoughts fade. The noise of regret, of memory, softened. It was terrifying and freeing. "The truth is not always spoken," the monk said. "Sometimes it waits for you to hear it." They met every day after that. Not for teaching, but for stillness. Evelyn swept the temple floors, stacked stones along the garden path, lit incense at dawn. The monk never preached. Instead, he posed quiet questions. "What does stillness feel like? What are you without your name?" She didn't always have answers. Sometimes she grew frustrated, craving logic or steps. But slowly, something shifted. She began noticing small things. A butterfly resting on her hand, how the wind moved like breath, how her own breath no longer raced with panic. One evening, while lighting a lantern, she whispered, "I've always been running, but from where?" The monk, passing by, said softly, "Perhaps from the part of you that never left." A storm came after weeks of calm, wild, crashing winds and torrential rain. The shrine flooded. Evelyn helped the villagers secure wood and move offerings uphill. She worked in silence, wet hair plastered to her cheeks, her body aching. That night, she sat beside the monk near a fire. "The storm reminds me of my mind," she said. "Chaotic, unrelenting, full of destruction." He handed her a cup of tea. "And yet, the soil will be richer tomorrow." She stared into the fire. "Is that all healing is, waiting for the storm to pass?" He shook his head. "No, it's learning to plant even in the downpour." Evelyn sipped the tea. Bitter at first, then warmth. The next morning, the rain had stopped. Mist clung to the mountains like breath. Evelyn stepped barefoot into the temple courtyard. The ground was soaked, yet somehow it felt soft, not broken. She looked up and found the monk already raking wet leaves into spirals across the earth. "What is the lesson today?" she asked. He didn't pause. "You don't need one, you've already begun." Evelyn took the other rake and joined him. Each motion, a breath. Each spiral, a release. For the first time, she wasn't looking for answers. She was simply present. She felt her past dissolve like dew. In silence, side by side, they worked until the courtyard gleamed. Not clean. Alive. Evelyn was raking leaves when she saw a woman arrive at the temple gate. Young, hurried, phone clutched in one hand, suitcase dragging behind. The woman barked into her Bluetooth headset, visibly agitated. Evelyn watched as the monk approached the woman and bowed slightly. "No signal here," he said gently. The woman scoffed. "I need to check in. Where's the reception?" The monk simply replied, "You've already arrived." Confused and frustrated, the woman walked away. Evelyn remained silent, observing. "That night," she asked, "why did you speak in riddles?" The monk said, "Some people don't hear answers. They only hear what confirms their noise." Evelyn nodded. She once lived in that noise. She recognized it in the woman's restless eyes. And for the first time, she didn't feel anger, just compassion for the person she used to be. That evening, Evelyn wandered into the meditation hall alone. Candlelight flickered across the wooden walls. She sat cross-legged on the floor and closed her eyes. But her mind would not settle. Thoughts poured in. The revelation of her adoption, her lost childhood, the father's last words. Her breath quickened. Tears welled up. "I can't do this," she whispered to the silence. Then she heard a quiet footstep. The monk sat beside her without a word. His presence didn't push or instruct, it simply shared space. After a few minutes, Evelyn exhaled and whispered again, "I don't know who I am." The monk looked into the candlelight and replied, "Then you are closer than ever." In her heart something cracked, but this time it was the shell. The next morning, Evelyn joined the monk by the river. "Why don't you tell people what to do?" she asked. He was skipping stones across the water. "Because no one ever listens until they are ready to hear," he said. "And by then, they no longer need telling." Evelyn picked up a flat stone, tried to skip it. Splash. She laughed. "I've been trying to force everything in my life. Every outcome, every relationship, every identity." The monk nodded. "You've been shaping the river instead of letting it shape you." Evelyn paused, then tried again. This time the stone danced 3 times before sinking. "Better," she smiled. "Not better," he replied, "just honest." She felt the truth in that word. Honest. For the first time, she wasn't performing. That afternoon, Evelyn explored the outer woods near the temple. She found a broken statue, an old carving of a Buddha, its face cracked down the middle. Moss had grown in the fractures. Yet somehow, it looked peaceful. She sat in front of it, mesmerized. The monk appeared behind her. "Why don't they fix it?" she asked. "It was never broken," he said. "Only changed." Evelyn stared longer. The cracks told a story, not of ruin, but of resilience. "So it's still sacred?" she whispered. "More so," he replied. "It no longer pretends to be perfect." Evelyn closed her eyes and breathed deeply. Her own cracks had been hidden for too long. Maybe it was time to stop hiding them. Evelyn sat by the fire that night, a journal in hand. For days she hadn't written. Words had felt distant, unreachable. But tonight they returned, not as explanations, but as reflections. She wrote, "I was lost because I believed I had to be someone I wasn't. But I am not the lie, or even the truth. I am the one who witnessed it all." Her hand trembled. For the first time, her writing wasn't for answers, it was for expression. She didn't need to explain herself to anyone. Not even herself. The monk passed behind her, nodding once. No words. No praise. Just presence. And Evelyn smiled, because presence was enough. Evelyn discovered a box tucked beneath a floorboard in the temple's archive room. Inside were letters, not hers, but written by others who had passed through this place. Stories of heartbreak, healing, loss, and rebirth. Each letter was folded with care, sealed not in envelopes, but with cloth ribbons. One letter stood out, to the one who doubts they belong. Evelyn's breath caught. She read the first line, "You're not alone in feeling alone." Her hands trembled. It was as if the person had reached through time to speak directly to her pain. She realized this wasn't a coincidence. Every soul who walked through these gates had carried a story. And like her, they had searched for something unnamed. She folded the letter again, eyes stinging, and whispered, "Thank you." Her healing wasn't just hers, it was a thread in a much larger tapestry. Later that day, the monk took Evelyn on a walk beyond the temple grounds, to a narrow hilltop path overlooking the valley. "Before you knew your truth," he said, "did you suffer?" Evelyn hesitated. "Yes, but I thought I understood who I was then." He nodded. "Sometimes comfort is the enemy of growth." She looked out over the cliffs. "But the pain, it shattered me." The monk replied, "Good. Shattering is how light gets in." A silence passed between them. Evelyn didn't argue this time. She simply stared into the horizon. The world below was vast, beautiful, terrifying. "I'm scared of who I'll become," she admitted. Then you are ready, the monk said. Fear only comes when you're on the edge of becoming. That night, Evelyn dreamt of her younger self. A little girl in a red dress standing alone in a hallway, staring into a mirror. In the dream, Evelyn approached her and knelt. Are you afraid? She asked. The girl nodded. Of what? Evelyn asked gently. Of being forgotten. Evelyn embraced her, whispering, I see you now. The mirror shattered behind them, but the girl didn't flinch. Instead, she took Evelyn's hand and smiled. Evelyn woke in tears. But for the first time, the tears didn't come from pain, they came from recognition. That hidden child, that wounded silence inside her, had been acknowledged. And with that, something long buried had returned, not as a wound, but as a guide. Evelyn found herself avoiding the monk the next morning. Something had shifted after the dream. She needed space. She walked deep into the woods alone. At a stream she shouted. A wordless cry. It wasn't rage or sorrow, it was release. Her voice echoed across the trees, birds scattering. She knelt, splashing water on her face, laughing through the tears. She was no longer afraid to feel, even if it made no sense. The silence afterward wasn't empty. It was earned. The monk appeared behind her again, silent as always. She turned, expecting wisdom, but he only smiled. You don't need me anymore, he said. She didn't deny it. She simply bowed. That evening, Evelyn lit incense at the shrine alone. No instructions, no audience. She knelt slowly, palms together, not in ritual, but in presence. The smoke rose like a ribbon, twisting in the fading sun. She closed her eyes and whispered, I forgive you, not to her father, not to the world, but to herself. I'm not broken, she said aloud. I was buried. The wind lifted the smoke into the sky, dissolving into twilight. She stood without tears. There was no dramatic change, no thunder or epiphany. Just peace. And that was enough. She turned and walked back toward the temple, shadows stretching ahead like open arms. Evelyn stood at the edge of the temple path, suitcase in hand. Her time here had not ended, but it had transformed. The monk approached, his steps deliberate. Are you leaving? He asked. She nodded. I think I'm ready to walk my own path now. He smiled faintly. Then walk with your feet, not your fear. She laughed. You always speak in riddles. No, he said. I speak in truths you're ready to hear. She embraced him, her body light, unburdened. Thank you for not fixing me. The monk's eyes softened. You were never broken. You were simply unopened. She walked away slowly, the temple behind her fading into memory, not as a place of answers, but of beginnings. Her steps were slow but certain. She returned to the city, but it no longer looked the same. The noise, the movement, the crowds, they weren't chaotic now, just alive. Evelyn walked through familiar streets like a stranger, and yet she wasn't disconnected. She observed. A child crying turned into a mother's embrace. A homeless man smiled at her as she handed him bread. These weren't acts of charity, they were mirrors. She saw her past self in all of them. The lost, the seeking, the unnoticed. At a street corner, she paused beside a mirror in a shop window. Her reflection didn't surprise her anymore. For the first time, she saw someone she could trust. Not because she was perfect, but because she was whole, even in her imperfections. She visited her father's grave for the first time since the funeral. The cemetery was quiet, only birdsong in the trees. Evelyn knelt before the headstone, fingers tracing his name. I hated you, she whispered. And I loved you. And I still don't know which one is louder. She set down a small white stone. But I know you tried. A breeze moved through the leaves, as if brushing past her. And I know now, I wasn't your blood, but I was your daughter. She stood slowly. No tears. Just truth. Forgiveness didn't arrive in fireworks, it came in stillness, in the soft acceptance of contradiction. She walked away, lighter than before. Not forgetting him, but freeing him. Back in her apartment, Evelyn opened the letter she once feared, the adoption record. She sat at her kitchen table, hands steady. The name of her birth mother stared back at her. A stranger, yet somehow familiar. Evelyn closed her eyes and whispered the name aloud. No lightning bolt, no unraveling, just breath. She folded the letter, set it aside, and made tea. The kettle's whistle was loud but comforting. She didn't feel the urge to chase the story anymore. She knew the facts wouldn't make her whole. She already was. She looked at the steam rising from her cup and thought, maybe the truth isn't in the answers, but in how we live with the questions. That evening, Evelyn stepped out onto her rooftop, the city lights blinking below. She looked up at the stars, not to find meaning, but to feel their presence. In the stillness she whispered, "I'm here." No audience. No echo. Just the rhythm of her own breath. She smiled, not because everything made sense, but because she no longer needed it to. The journey hadn't answered every question. It had simply returned her to herself. The version she'd buried. The version she was ready to meet. As the wind passed over her skin, Evelyn whispered again, "I'm still becoming." And that, at last, was enough. Evelyn received a letter in the mail. A handwritten note from the young woman she had seen at the temple weeks ago. "I didn't understand then," it read, "but I stayed. And I listened." The woman spoke of how silence had terrified her, how stillness had cracked open something she didn't know was buried. Evelyn smiled. She folded the letter, placed it gently on her bookshelf, and stared at the quiet space around her. Healing, she realized, was contagious, not because it spread loudly, but because it echoed in silence. Every scar she embraced had made room for someone else to do the same. Her own journey had not ended, it had rippled outward. She wasn't the same woman who had once crumbled at a bedside. She was a mirror now. And somewhere, someone else was beginning to look into it. Evelyn began teaching mindfulness classes at a local community center. She didn't speak as a guru, but as a witness. Her words were simple, her tone gentle. "You don't need to be fixed," she told a room of strangers. "You just need to remember, you were never broken." A young man wept. An older woman closed her eyes and finally breathed. Afterward, no one clapped. They just sat together, in presence. Evelyn watched them, not as a leader, but as part of the circle. She no longer needed to carry answers. She only needed to hold space. As the lights dimmed, she realized this was how the monk had held space for her. And now, it was her turn to pass that stillness forward. One afternoon, Evelyn visited the park she hadn't returned to in years, the one near her childhood home. The swings creaked, wind moved through the trees like whispers from the past. She sat on a bench where her father once watched her play. The memory arrived not as pain, but as a soft ache. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I forgive you." Not out of duty, not to erase what happened, but because she no longer needed to carry his silence as her own. The child in her deserved to run free, not under the shadow of a lie, but in the light of acceptance. She rose from the bench, smiling. The past wasn't undone, but it no longer defined her steps. Evelyn hosted a small gathering at her apartment. Not a party, just candles, tea, and conversation. Friends sat in a circle, some old, some new. One guest said, "You seem grounded." Evelyn laughed softly. "Maybe I just stopped pretending I'm not floating." They all laughed. Then silence. Comfortable, warm. She looked around and saw what she once feared, being truly seen. Not through roles or achievements, but through presence. There was no performance, no need to impress. Just shared breath, flickering light, and unspoken understanding. Evelyn realized she wasn't filling space anymore, she was simply part of it. And that was enough. Later that night, Evelyn stood alone on her balcony. The city buzzed beneath her, but up here, it was quiet. She watched a plane blink across the sky and whispered, "I'm not who I was." Not a question, not a longing. Just truth. Her pain hadn't vanished, but it no longer owned her. Her story hadn't changed, but she had rewritten her place in it. She closed her eyes and felt it, the quiet joy of becoming, not as a destination, but as a constant motion. She was still learning, still stumbling, still soft. But she was no longer afraid to be seen in her becoming. Evelyn breathed deeply and smiled. The journey didn't end. It simply opened. Weeks later, Evelyn returned to the mountain temple, not as the same woman who had once arrived broken, but as someone newly whole. The air was crisper now. Now, autumn leaves blanketed the path, golden and red like fire still. She entered silently. The monk was sweeping just as before. He looked up and smiled. "Welcome home," he said. She bowed. "I didn't think I'd come back." "You didn't," he said. "But you arrived." She laughed, the sound light, not forced. They shared no ceremony, no ritual, just tea and silence on the temple steps. The mountains held their breath. And Evelyn, she didn't seek answers. She simply witnessed everything as it was. No striving, no fixing, just presence. And that was more sacred than she had ever imagined. That evening, Evelyn lit a lantern and walked the inner courtyard. Shadows danced gently against the shrine walls. She paused beside the cracked Buddha statue she'd once questioned. The moss had spread, the crack still visible, but she no longer saw it as a flaw. It had become the most beautiful part. She knelt and ran her fingers across the stone. "We are both still here," she whispered. The wind replied with a hush. It wasn't transcendence she felt. It was grounding. It was truth without words. She was no longer afraid of her story. She no longer rejected the scar. It was a part of her temple now, unhidden, unhealed, unashamed. Before dawn, Evelyn stood by the river where she once struggled with silence. Fog hovered above the water like a whisper. She closed her eyes, feeling the air move through her chest. Not a meditation, not a performance, just breath. She remembered her first words to the monk. "I don't know what I'm looking for." And now she still didn't, but she no longer needed to. Seeking had become seeing. Her life was not a puzzle to be solved, but a canvas to be lived. She opened her eyes and smiled at the water. It didn't flow for answers, it simply flowed. And now, so did she. Evelyn prepared to leave once more, not with sorrow, but with grace. She packed no souvenirs, only space. Space within her mind. Space within her heart. She bowed to the temple before descending the path. The monk stood far behind her, offering no goodbye. He didn't need to. She walked slowly down the mountain trail, not because she was uncertain, but because she was savoring. Every step was sacred. Every breath, a note in the music of return. She had once arrived shattered. She now left shaped, not into someone else, but into herself. And the world below waited, not as an escape, but as a mirror. As Evelyn reached the base of the mountain, she stopped and looked back one last time. The temple was barely visible, just a dot of stillness nestled in the peaks. She touched her chest gently and whispered, "I remember now." It wasn't about who she used to be, or even who she might become. It was about who she chose to be in this moment. Whole. Present. Real lol. The sun crested the mountain ridge, bathing her in a soft, golden light. And in that stillness, a sentence rose within her, one that echoed through every part of her being. I was never lost. I just hadn't arrived yet.